Hey everybody, it's Tom and I'm coming to you today. This is the third in a series of videos where we are endeavoring to render some definition for concepts which, though very important to the public discourse and often used in the public discourse, are rarely granted specificity. And as a consequence, they're liable to vague, or as I said before, contradictory usages. And the word which I want to take up today and discuss today is the word of class. Now, in ordinary everyday conversation, in my experience, when people use the word class, it's often not to refer to a specific class so much as to that complex which we might denote as class society, or the circumstance that society as a whole is segmented into differing sections based on differing criteria, and in virtue of that segmentation, that separation, what you find is a distribution of resources and power along fundamentally unequal lines. Now, historically, various external principles have been invoked. Tradition really has been invoked to justify the circumstance, whether that be through an appeal to some kind of divine authority, which is sort of the most common strategy, or perhaps simply an appeal to the standard or ideal of tradition itself, which you can see, for example, in more primary societies, or in a medieval context, you have the idea of the divine right of kings, etc., etc. And these factors or forces continue to play a role in how things operate in the world today, but not with the power which they once did. And in a way, we can thank the revolutionary occurrences of the 18th and 19th century in part for that development, which isn't to say things are all hunky-dory, because we still exist very much in a class society, both on a national basis and on a global basis. And one powerful way of seeing this is looking at money, which is often very much an index of power and how power is variously distributed. They're not identical, but they map very closely onto one another. And in a way, you could almost say that money is an expression or a currency of social power. Some people have made that move. For example, there's this guy, David Harvey, who has some very illuminating things to say. I'd recommend checking out his work. And he's sort of taken that tact as an example. But to get back to the notion of class proper in our own society, as I mentioned, historically there's been an appeal to exogenous factors, external factors, divine authority, tradition, etc. But what is enforcing the reality of a class divide in our own society? And certainly if you look at the distribution of material resource, it's very difficult to divide that something like that is at hand. In this connection, I'd like to bring up a seemingly disparate concept, but one which ultimately ramifies powerfully for our understanding of class. That's the concept of the commodity, which is noted, for example, in our discussion of capitalism, as sort of the fundamental building block of the economic structure more generally. That is what we buy, and that is what we sell. Commodity is to what we fix this thing we call price. But what is it that price reflects? Value. And what is that value? The value is the labor time which is invested in the production of that commodity. So that's relatively straightforward. That's the conclusion of people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and other of the classical political economists that really laid the groundwork for what would become initially the justification for capitalism. But then Karl Marx sort of took that a little further, and what was at one time a justification became a criticism, which in its own turn provoked another school of thought about value, largely coming out of what is called the Austrian school, where you had this idea of value being a reflection of marginal utility. And in my view, the doctrine of marginal utility really is only concealing the primacy of the exchange value by painting use value through its own narrow lens. So we sort of touched on what I'm getting at there in the capitalism video. So if it's a bit vague for you, we can I'd point you in that direction, and that might help elucidate what I'm getting at. But to draw us back, you're like, well, what does this have to do with class? Well, this is what it has to do with class. When labor itself becomes a commodity, the price of labor is the cost of its own reproduction, which is to say the wage, which is what is the price of labor, is set at a level which enables the laborer really just to come back to work the next day. Now that's obviously more than food. That is, it's also going to be involved in paying for his shelter or her shelter, a certain degree of physical and psychical comfort, and there's a non-trivial amount of cultural relativity in determining what is the basal level which should be employed to determine a just wage. And in our own society, we see this in a way in the discussions around the minimum wage. But what is clear, nonetheless, is that in virtue of the fact that the vast majority of people end up working for a wage in a direct or indirect way, locates them within a single class, a subordinate class in the capitalist context. The overarching or dominant class is going to be the capitalist class, which are those people, the bourgeois as they're classically termed, who own the means of production and leverage that means of production to be able to capture people within the wage relationship. And then, of course, what happens is the person who are being paid the wage produce more in the space of time in which they are earning that wage than is necessary to simply bring them back to work the next day. And the capitalist or the owner appropriates the excess unto themselves, giving them control over, more or less, the vast majority of resources in the society. Now, this is a somewhat simplified account, but adequate to convey the gist, whereby I mean to express that the basis whereupon class relations are maintained in our own society is essentially an economic one, and incredible faith in the logic of the narrative of neoclassical and classical economics and the power of the commodity and the market is apparently adequate arbiters of how things should get done. And by granting them this power, this privileging, we in effect have allowed the control of society's resources to devolve into the hands of a very few. Now again, this is a simplification. There are lots of wrinkles we can bring into it. Within this subordinate class, often termed the proletariat, there are, subdivisions, professional, skilled, unskilled, and all the rest of it. Within the capitalist class, there are divisions. There's different kinds of capitalists. There's industrial capitalists who are in possession of actively productive, if you like, capital. People won't car factories and that sort of thing. There are merchant capitalists, people who buy and sell, like Walmart. There's financial capitalists, and then like bankers, and there is an additional class. The old word for it is the rentier class, right, or the landowning class. Real estate landowners. That's another special sort of category of capital. What's interesting is that the most productive, the merchant, the finance, and the rentier segments of the capitalist aggregate really are parasitically related to the industrial class, which is the only class which is in possession of actively creative value, and that is in virtue of their command over people who are actually making things. So, anyway, this isn't the only way in which a class society can arise. You can look at, for example, at India and their caste system historically as an additional situation where forces of tradition segment groups of the population along lines which map with the division of labor, but which aren't ruled by the same internal logic of a capitalist framework. But that's how things work in our society predominantly. And now, so when we talk about class, and these are the sorts of issues on which I think we really need to focus our attention if we're going to move forward to a space where we reinvent society so that we don't have class anymore. Because class, to admit and to condone class in this sense, is to admit and condone inequality as something which we should accept as part of the structure of who and what we are as human beings and as a human society. And for my person, and I suspect for a very large portion of the audience here, that's a non-starter. We should not have our society organized along lines which necessarily will favor or empower a few to the subordination of the many. Or for that matter, a many to the subordination of the few. People should not be reliant on a situation in which the dominant social relationships are ones of inequality. So I want to follow that up with a kind of appendix, an addendum to that little discursus, with reference to the idea of the middle class. And the concept and the category of the middle class is one which figures and looms large in a lot of talk here in the U.S. and in how Americans have often forged their own sense of identity. To me, the middle class is fundamentally an illusion that was made possible by a peculiar set of circumstances which arose in the wake of World War II, which allowed what was really the working class, or a large segment of the working class, to experience an unexpected degree of abundance. What were those peculiar circumstances? Well, there was the U.S.'s unusually favorable position globally. There was a kind of agreement between the trade unions to depart from their historical radicalism and enter into a so-called congenial relationship with business. These are the two biggest factors. There are other things going on as well. For example, the New Deal, which was really a concession to radical segments of the American population, sort of forgotten because of historical amnesia, to diffuse a real force of agitation which had grown up and was burgeoning as a result of the Great Depression in the 20s. All these things come together, so the New Deal, a kind of welfareism, to allow a large segment of the proletariat to favor, to experience a prosperity which is actually out of step with the structure of what would have been a bare bones capitalist framework. And this illusion, especially set against the context of the Cold War, sort of obscured or concealed what was really a more basic structural divide between the many and the few, and which nowadays is often termed through the lens of the 1% versus the 99%, which is a kind of fun tagline, but suffers from that. It loses lots of the nuance and also gives the impression that the 1% are simply acting beyond the bounds of the way things should be, and where their behavior hardly accords with ethical normativity, it actually does accord very much with the logic of the system of capitalism itself. So, much then by way of class, the issues we associate with it. Again, basic definition isn't too hard to find in this case. It's simply a class, strictly speaking, is a segment of a society within a class society which has a particular allocation of power or material resource. But the preconception is that, or the predicate of that, is that the society is going to be virtually by definition unequal. There is a logical space wherein you can conceive of the classes being equal, but then the category of class itself would become superfluous. And now we've been talking now a lot about the economy and material differentiation and all this sort of stuff, and we've identified class as something which has a largely economic determination. I would say that the economic determination is actually an expression of an underlying political determination, because I think power rather than finance is the real denominator here. There are other axes along which inequity can manifest itself. And that's what we're going to be taking up in the next video, a few videos. And we're talking about race, we're talking about ethnicity, those two are very, and gender. These are the other sort of three, and you can sort of race and ethnic what's the word I'm looking for? Not prejudice, but the oppression in light of racial or ethnic difference is a big deal. Those two sort of are similarly structured. They're not the same. And then, of course, gender, where over half the human population is in a position of disadvantage. The relationship between these elements of oppression and disenfranchisement and the framework which I've set out here is admittedly a messy one. And this is just the beginning. This is the vestibule to the broader conversation. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up here for today. And so once again, it's been Tom, and thank you guys for listening. And tomorrow, I'm going to endeavor to pick up the issues of race, maybe race and ethnicity. We might bring those together into a single episode. And then gender is its own thing. All right, guys. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye.